10 years ago, I saved a drowning boy. I performed a rapid rescue, bringing him back to consciousness. When he woke up, he looked at me with determined eyes and declared, "I've decided to marry you when I grow up." Thinking he was just a naive child, I laughed it off and didn't take his words seriously. But 10 years later, that boy had grown into a powerful and domineering CEO, Brian Hawk. On the day of my wedding to my fiancé, Brian stormed in with a group of men, brutally beating up my groom and forcibly taking me away. "I told you I would marry you. Your husband can only be me." With my family's lives as leverage, he forced me into a marriage I never wanted. He locked me away in a private villa, forbidding any man from coming near me. Day after day, he tried every possible means to win me over, but I remained unmoved. Frustrated, he found someone who looked eerily similar to me, Ariel Berg. Using his affection and favoritism, Ariel did whatever she pleased. One day, she forced her way into the villa where I was imprisoned. Her eyes blazed with jealousy as she sneered, "Where did this cheap woman come from? How dare she pretend to be me and seduce my man? I will tear you apart today." She stripped me naked, cut out my tongue, and ordered the bodyguards to violate and humiliate me. By the time Brian arrived, it was too late. Ariel dragged my lifeless body before him, her expression triumphant. Smirking, she said, "Darling, this woman had plastic surgery to look like me and tried to seduce you. So, I killed her for you." Brian Hawk was obsessed, completely, devastatingly obsessed. From the moment I saved him, he had sworn to marry no one else but me. For 3 years, he kept me imprisoned, showering me with gifts, affection, and relentless devotion. But I, who had never loved him, could not bring myself to accept him. Recently, he brought in Ariel, the woman who looked almost exactly like me. For months, they acted like a loving couple, and to torment me, Brian would send me videos of their intimate moments on WhatsApp. I sat in the courtyard, watching another one of those videos, when a commotion erupted outside. "Brian comes here every few days. Today, I want to see what kind of treasure he's hiding in this villa." But didn't Mr. Hawk declare this villa a private restricted area? No one is allowed inside. Yes, Ariel, I heard that someone once took a single glance inside, and Brian broke his hands and gouged out his eyes. "Isn't it dangerous for us to sneak in? What are you afraid of?" Ariel scoffed. "Brian dotes on me to the bone. He won't blame me." Hearing their voices, unease settled in my stomach. No one knew better than me just how insane Brian could be. His possessiveness was terrifying. He treated me as his personal property, locking me away from the world. Once, a man had snuck into the villa out of curiosity and caught a glimpse of me. The next day, Brian disabled his hands, crushed his feet, and gouged out his eyes. After that, the man disappeared, as if he had never existed. At first, Brian's jealousy was only aimed at men. But then he noticed that while I had never shown him any kindness, I treated the housemaids with gentleness. That was the final straw. He fired every single maid in a blind rage, choosing to personally bring me my meals instead. No one but him was allowed to look me in the eyes. And now, these people were about to step into Brian's forbidden zone. I knew they were in danger. I quickly stood, rushing to warn them before it was too late. But as I stepped outside, I came face to face with her. Ariel Berg. She looked almost identical to me. Before I could say a word, she slapped me hard across the face. Her eyes blazed with hatred as she spat, "Where did this cheap woman come from? How dare you disguise yourself as me and hide in Brian's villa? Do you think you can compete with me for my man?" A sharp slap landed across my face, making my skin burn with pain. "You cheap woman. You think you can get away with sneaking in here? Do you even know where you are?" Ariel Berg's voice dripped with contempt. "You deliberately made yourself look like me to seduce Mr. Hawk. You've thrown away your dignity just to climb the social ladder, haven't you?" At that moment, I finally realized who had attacked me, Ariel Berg, the substitute Brian had found to replace me. Because of Brian's obsessive need for control, I had always remained indifferent to him. Even though he had forced me into marriage, I refused to acknowledge him as my husband. I never let him touch me. Perhaps out of resentment, or a desperate attempt to fill the void, he searched tirelessly for a woman who looked just like me. And Ariel Berg was the closest match he had found. Now, standing before me with burning rage in her eyes, she seethed with jealousy. "You filthy slut. You know Brian is madly in love with me, so you're trying to steal my place. You even had plastic surgery to look like me, didn't you? You want to take my place and become his woman." Ariel's arrogance was unbearable. I didn't bother to argue with her about the slap. Instead, I calmly warned her, "You shouldn't be here. Leave now, before Brian arrives. Otherwise, no one will be able to protect you." But instead of heeding my warning, Ariel's expression twisted with fury. She grabbed a fistful of my hair and yanked it hard, forcing my head back. "Brian is my man. I can go anywhere I please on his property. You're just afraid I'll ruin your little scheme, aren't you? You don't want the real woman in his life to expose your lies." Her eyes glowed with malice. "Today, I'll teach you a lesson. You'll know what happens to women who try to steal my man." Without warning, she kicked me hard, sending me crashing to the ground. My body hit the sharp rocks, and a deep gash opened on my forehead. Blood trickled down my face. I lifted my hand to touch the wound, then looked up at Ariel's imposing figure. "Aren't you afraid Brian will find out about this?" I asked coldly. Ariel merely sneered. "Brian is obsessed with me. If I get even a tiny scratch, he won't rest for days. Even if he finds out, so what? Do you really think he'd punish me for hurting someone as insignificant as you?" The women around her laughed mockingly. "That's right. Everyone knows Mr. Hawk fell in love with Ariel at first sight. You're nothing but an imitator." Ariel, with Mr. Hawk's status, desperate women like this one must try to seduce him all the time. "Let's make her an example." "Exactly. Let's show all these social climbing bitches who the real Mrs. Hawk is." Their words dripped with venom. The way they looked at me, hungry for destruction, made my stomach twist. But I didn't flinch. Instead, I met Ariel's eyes head-on. "You should ask Brian who I am." Ariel tilted her chin, her lips curling into a cruel smirk. "A nobody like you? You think I need to ask about your identity?" Her voice was filled with scorn. "I am Brian's chosen woman. The Berg family is the Hawk family's most important business partner. Who the hell are you? What right do you have to challenge me?" Then, her gaze darkened, and she turned to the women behind her. "Strip this bitch naked. I want to see if she copied my body too." At her command, her so-called friends lunged at me, grabbing at my clothes, tearing at the fabric with vicious glee. I struggled against them, desperately trying to fight them off. In a panic, I screamed, "Stop! I am Brian's wife." Hearing my words, they immediately froze. Ariel stepped aside, squinting at me. "Did you just say you're Brian's wife?" I met her gaze without hesitation. "Yes. You're the substitute he found. If he finds out you hurt me like this, he won't let you go." I thought revealing the truth would finally make her back down. I was wrong. Instead, they all burst into laughter, their mocking voices overlapping. "Did you hear that? This bitch actually thinks she can replace you, Ariel. Just because she looks a little like you, she dares to say you're the fake one? Everyone knows Mr. Hawk takes Ariel everywhere. Meanwhile, this plastic surgery fraud is hiding away like a dirty little secret." Ariel's expression turned even more vicious. "I thought you might be at least a little clever, considering you had the nerve to impersonate me. But you're just a delusional idiot." She smirked. "I've been with Brian for so long, and I've never even heard him mention a wife. Do you really think you can fool us with such an outrageous lie?" She crossed her arms, sneering. "If you were really Mrs. Hawk, why would you be locked away in this desolate villa, completely forgotten?" Then, without hesitation, she snapped her fingers and ordered her friends, "Strip her. I don't want a single piece of clothing left on her." At her command, her so-called friends lunged at me. They clawed at my clothes, tearing at the fabric with frenzied delight. None of them understood the real reason why no one else lived in this villa. Brian owns all this land. No one is allowed here without his permission. This place used to be full of bodyguards and maids, but Brian dismissed them all because of his jealousy. He hides me from the world so that no one else can look at me, even speaking about me in his presence is forbidden. The cruel irony was that the very measures Brian had taken to possess me had now made them doubt my existence. As my clothes were ripped apart, panic seized me. I struggled and screamed, "I am Brian's wife. If you don't believe me, call him." But my words only seemed to enrage them further. Ariel's friends slapped me mercilessly, their strikes sharp and relentless. "You lying whore. Let's see how we can beat the truth out of you." Blow after blow landed on my face. Soon, my cheeks were swollen, my skin bruised and burning with pain. My disheveled clothes barely covered me, exposing large portions of my skin to their sadistic amusement. Ariel's lips curled into a slow, malicious smile. "This bitch's hair is such an eyesore. It's covering too much of her pathetic body." Then, her eyes gleamed with something far more sinister. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a lighter. Click. The tiny flame flickered to life. Before I could react, she grabbed a handful of my hair and set it on fire. The flame spread rapidly. A scorching heat engulfed my scalp, searing my skin. A blinding, unbearable pain exploded through me. I screamed, instinctively trying to slap out the fire, but they held me down, forcing me to burn. The stench of singed flesh filled the air. Within seconds, my hair was gone, burned to nothing but blackened patches. My scalp throbbed with deep, agonizing burns. Ariel tilted her head, admiring her handiwork. Then, she let out a laugh of pure satisfaction. "Look at you now, bald and ugly. Let's see how you plan to seduce men looking like this." Her friends erupted into applause, delighting in my suffering. My entire body trembled with rage. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my skin. My voice was raw and filled with fury as I spat out, "You will regret this." Brian had threatened my family to keep me here. He had imprisoned me for years, leaving me to waste away in this empty villa. I had endured so much. But this? This was the final straw. Ariel took a step forward, pressing the sole of her designer shoe heavily against my face. "Regret," she scoffed. Then, her voice dropped into something cold and merciless. "Since your mouth keeps spouting nonsense, you don't need it anymore." She turned to her friends, her eyes gleaming with cruelty. "Cut out this bitch's tongue." At Ariel's command, one of her bodyguards stepped forward, gripping a dagger. The cold gleam of the blade sent a wave of terror through me. One of Ariel's friends, a timid girl, hesitated. "Ariel, this is Mr. Hawk's territory. Is it really okay for us to make such a big scene?" Ariel scoffed, unfazed. "What's the problem? Brian is my man. His house is my house. I'm just teaching a shameless bitch a lesson in my own home. Who would dare say anything to me?" She smirked. "Besides, Brian loves me more than anything. Even if I kill her, he won't even bat an eye." Her other friends chimed in. "That's right. Ariel is Mr. Hawk's most beloved woman. There's nothing she can't do. When the time comes, Mr. Hawk will only feel sorry for Ariel for exhausting herself over this cheap woman." Hearing their words, the timid girl's hesitation faded. She relaxed, watching the scene unfold with cold amusement. I lay on the ground, my heart pounding as the bodyguard drew closer. Panic surged through me. "I am Brian's wife. If you do this, he will never let you go." But my words fell on deaf ears. The bodyguard knelt beside me, pressing the dagger against my lips. I struggled, but Ariel's friends pinned me down, their fingers digging into my skin. I thrashed, trying to escape. But then, a sharp, searing pain tore through my mouth. The blade sliced deep. Blood gushed, pooling in my throat. A horrifying moment passed before I saw it, my own severed tongue lying in a pool of crimson. The agony was unbearable. My body convulsed as a silent scream wrenched through me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't speak. Ariel crossed her arms, looking down at me with cruel satisfaction. Even after getting plastic surgery to look like me, you really thought Brian would take you seriously? She laughed coldly. He loves me, not just my face. Understand? She knelt beside me, whispering in my ear. Not everyone is lucky enough to live the life I do. Brian doesn't fall for just any woman. Then, her lips curled into something truly wicked. Since you're so desperate for a man, I'll give you a few. Turning to the bodyguards, she said carelessly, she's all yours. The one who works the hardest gets $2 million. At her words, the bodyguards' eyes lit up. They stepped forward eagerly, rubbing their hands together like beasts ready to devour their prey. I lay there, completely powerless. I tried to scream, but my tongue was gone. My mouth was full of blood. I couldn't make a sound. Tears streamed down my face as despair swallowed me whole. Brian had locked me away obsessively, but he had never touched me. Even when I rejected him, he never forced himself on me. He always said, I'll wait until you're ready. You were meant to be mine. But now, his so-called love had led me to this. Helpless. Ruined. Defiled. Tears blurred my vision as I silently cried. Brian, is this what you wanted? Ariel's friends laughed, cheering her on. Ariel is meant to be Mrs. Hawk. No one else stands a chance. Look at her now, she was so defiant before, but now she's nothing. It's hilarious. Congratulations, Ariel. No one will ever challenge your place beside Mr. Hawk again. Ariel smiled triumphantly, basking in their praise. But then, one of the bodyguards suddenly froze. His eyes widened as he pointed at me. Miss Berg, she's dead. A hush fell over the group. Ariel's victorious smirk faltered. Her expression twisted in disgust. Ugh. How unlucky. She waved a hand dismissively. Get rid of her. Bury her somewhere before she stinks up Brian's house. But just as she finished speaking, a deep, chilling voice echoed through the courtyard. What are you doing? Everyone froze. I barely clung to consciousness as I saw him. Brian Hawk. He stood at the entrance, his piercing gaze scanning the blood-stained scene before him. And in that moment, I knew. Ariel had finally gone too far. When Brian spoke, everyone turned to look at him. Dressed in a high-end custom suit, he carried himself with quiet authority. His black-rimmed glasses lent him a composed, intellectual air, but behind them, his crystal-clear eyes burned with an icy sharpness. The moment Ariel saw him, her arrogance melted away. Smiling sweetly, she stepped toward him and said softly, Brian, aren't you in an emergency meeting? What brings you here? Brian ignored her question. His voice was devoid of warmth as he asked, did I not make it clear that no one is allowed in this villa? What are you doing here? Ariel flinched under his gaze, but quickly composed herself. Brian, I saw a suspicious woman sneaking in. She obviously had plastic surgery to resemble someone else. I followed her here to catch her. Brian's brow furrowed slightly. He glanced past her, toward the villa. Did you go inside? Ariel shook her head quickly. No. We stayed in the yard the whole time. Sensing the shift in Brian's demeanor, Ariel's friends hurriedly chimed in. Mr. Hawk, Ariel knows how important this place is to you. She wouldn't do anything reckless. Yes. The moment she saw someone trespassing, she got worried. She was only trying to protect you. Ariel loves you so much, Brian. She only acted out of concern. Please don't be mad at her. Brian's expression remained cold, but their words seemed to soften him slightly. Still, his tone was indifferent as he said, you shouldn't come here again. Ariel's smile faltered. Why not? She pouted slightly. I think this place is nice. It's a shame to leave it abandoned. Why don't I live here instead? She batted her lashes, her big eyes full of expectation. For a brief moment, Brian looked almost amused. But then, his expression darkened again. Ariel noticed the shift and immediately looked hurt. Brian, did I say something wrong? Brian's gaze drifted to the window of my room. Ariel's friends laughed, cheering her on. Ariel is meant to be Mrs. Hawk. No one else stands a chance. Look at her now, she was so defiant before, but now she's nothing. It's hilarious. Congratulations, Ariel. No one will ever challenge your place beside Mr. Hawk again. Ariel smiled triumphantly, basking in their praise. But then, one of the bodyguards suddenly froze. His eyes widened as he pointed at me. Miss Berg, she's dead. A hush fell over the group. Ariel's victorious smirk faltered. Her expression twisted in disgust. Ugh. How unlucky. She waved a hand dismissively. Get rid of her. Bury her somewhere before she stinks up Brian's house. But just as she finished speaking, a deep, chilling voice echoed through the courtyard. What are you doing? Everyone froze. I barely clung to consciousness as I saw him. Brian Hawk. He stood at the entrance, his piercing gaze scanning the blood-stained scene before him. And in that moment, I knew. Ariel had finally gone too far. When Brian spoke, everyone turned to look at him. Dressed in a high-end custom suit, he carried himself with quiet authority. His black-rimmed glasses lent him a composed, intellectual air, but behind them, his crystal-clear eyes burned with an icy sharpness. The moment Ariel saw him, her arrogance melted away. Smiling sweetly, she stepped toward him and said softly, Brian, aren't you in an emergency meeting? What brings you here? Brian ignored her question. His voice was devoid of warmth as he asked, Did I not make it clear that no one is allowed in this villa? What are you doing here? Ariel flinched under his gaze, but quickly composed herself. Brian, I saw a suspicious woman sneaking in. She obviously had plastic surgery to resemble someone else. I followed her here to catch her. Brian's brow furrowed slightly. He glanced past her, toward the villa. Did you go inside? Ariel shook her head quickly. No. We stayed in the yard the whole time. Sensing the shift in Brian's demeanor, Ariel's friends hurriedly chimed in. Mr. Hawk, Ariel knows how important this place is to you. She wouldn't do anything reckless. Yes. The moment she saw someone trespassing, she got worried. She was only trying to protect you. Ariel loves you so much, Brian. She only acted out of concern. Please don't be mad at her. Brian's expression remained cold, but their words seemed to soften him slightly. Still, his tone was indifferent as he said, You shouldn't come here again. Ariel's smile faltered. Why not? She pouted slightly. I think this place is nice. It's a shame to leave it abandoned. Why don't I live here instead? She batted her lashes, her big eyes full of expectation. For a brief moment, Brian looked almost amused. But then, his expression darkened again. Ariel noticed the shift and immediately looked hurt. Brian, did I say something wrong? Brian's gaze drifted to the window of my room. Suddenly, he smirked, a subtle, deliberate provocation. Then, in a calculated move, he pulled Ariel into his arms. His voice was gentle, almost tender, as he murmured, No. I just think you deserve to live somewhere better. Ariel's face lit up. Really? Brian nodded, his grip on her tightening. This place is too shabby. If you want to stay somewhere, you should stay at the Hawk family's manor. The Hawk family's manor. A place reserved only for members of the Hawk family. Ariel's breath hitched. Brian's words implied a future she had always dreamed of. Marriage. Power. A place by his side. She beamed. Are you serious? You'll let me stay there? Brian nodded again, his voice smooth. Of course. You've always been so obedient. Ariel practically glowed with happiness. But before she could speak, Brian's tone shifted, low, almost careless. By the way, this place is my private restricted area. If it weren't for your sake today, none of your bodyguards or friends would have left here alive. Silence. The air turned frigid. The bodyguard stiffened. Ariel's friends went pale. They knew Brian well enough. He never made empty threats. Ariel, however, clung to his arm, unbothered by the silent panic around her. She gazed up at him adoringly. I knew you loved me most. Brian smiled, a slow, unreadable smile. Leaning close, he whispered against her ear, Do you know what I love most about you? Ariel's heart fluttered. Her eyes sparkled with anticipation. What is it? Brian lifted her chin gently, then kissed her. It was deep. Affectionate. Deceptive. When he pulled away, his voice was barely above a whisper. I love it most when you say you love me, with this face. Ariel blushed furiously. Then, as if suddenly remembering something, her eyes gleamed. She spun around, dragged my lifeless body forward, and proudly presented me to Brian. Baby, this plastic surgery woman snuck into your villa. I killed her for you. Here's the corrected and refined version of your passage for better clarity, flow, and emotional impact. I lay on the ground, lifeless. My hair was gone, burned away. My scalp was covered in raw, painful scars. My face was swollen beyond recognition, marred with deep bruises. Bloodstains covered my body, leaving me disfigured and broken. From the gaping wound where my tongue had been severed, blood still oozed, pooling beneath me, a grotesque and horrifying sight. Brian didn't recognize me. He looked down at my mutilated body with nothing but disgust, as if I were something filthy, something unworthy of his attention. For a brief moment, his cold gaze lingered. Then, without a shred of concern, he turned to Ariel. His voice, filled with indulgence and praise, was soft. Gentle. Loving. You taught her a good lesson. Then, as if worried for Ariel, he sighed. But don't handle these matters personally in the future. If you get hurt, it would break my heart. He tenderly cupped her face, his thumb brushing over her cheek as if she were the most delicate, treasured thing in the world. Especially your face. His voice was low, reverent. The way he looked at her, full of adoration and obsession, was suffocating. Then, as if I were nothing but an inconvenience, he turned away from me completely. His tone was casual, dismissive. Bury the body. Don't make a mess of my yard. 2 bodyguards immediately obeyed, grabbing my limp form and dragging me away like discarded trash. Brian's gaze flickered toward the window of my room. The impatience in his eyes was obvious. As if he had expected to see someone there. Someone who never appeared. His jaw tensed. Annoyed, he pulled out his phone and dialed a number. His voice was steady but clipped. Bring the food from the car. Moments later, his driver arrived, carrying several insulated containers. One by one, Brian carefully set out the dishes on a table in the courtyard. Each dish was perfectly arranged. Each dish was made to my taste. Ariel's eyes lit up in delight. Brian, you're so good to me. You even prepared all this just for me. Brian glanced at the window again. Then, deliberately raising his voice, he spoke. You worked hard today, educating someone. I feel sorry for you. Then, for the first time, he picked up a dish and fed Ariel a bite. Ariel froze in shock. Though Brian had always spoiled her, he had never been this affectionate before. Her face flushed, and she shyly chewed, swallowing the food with a pleased smile. Her friends gushed with admiration. See? I told you. Ariel worked hard, and Mr. Hawk felt sorry for her. I envy Ariel. She's so lucky to have such a devoted man. That plastic surgery woman was laughable. She thought she could seduce Mr. Hawk? What a joke. No one in this world can ever replace Ariel in Mr. Hawk's heart. Brian fed Ariel bite by bite until she was full. She beamed, basking in the attention. But Brian. He was absent-minded. His eyes drifted toward my window, again and again. He had done all of this for one reason. To make me jealous. To make me watch. A voice interrupted his thoughts. Mr. Hawk, we buried the body. The bodyguards had returned, their work done. Still, there was no movement from inside the villa. Brian's patience snapped. He stood abruptly. Then, deliberately loud enough for the entire courtyard to hear, he said, Ariel, I'll take you to the Hawk family's manor now. If you like it, you can move in today. Ariel gasped in excitement, clutching his arm tightly. Really? Let's go now. I can't wait to live with you. Brian let her pull him forward. But as they walked away, he kept glancing back. Again. 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 And still, he never saw the person he wanted to see. His irritation deepened. Then, he stopped. His expression shifted. Shaking off Ariel's hand, he turned and strode back toward the villa. Ariel blinked in confusion. Brian? He ignored her. The moment he stepped inside, he rushed to my room and flung the door open. Don't you care? The words died in his throat. The room was empty. I was gone. His chest rose and fell. His fingers curled into fists. He searched the entire villa, refusing to accept what his eyes were telling him. Every corner. Every shadow. But there was no sign of me. Finally, he stormed out, his expression dark. His piercing gaze locked onto Ariel. His voice was low, dangerous. Where's the woman who was in this villa? His body was still. But beneath the surface, anger simmered. It threatened to spill over at any moment. Ariel's eyes widened in confusion. What woman? She blinked innocently. You mean the plastic surgery bitch? Besides her, I didn't see anyone else in the villa. Brian's expression darkened instantly, murderous rage flickering in his eyes. A plastic surgery woman who made herself look like you? His voice was dangerously low. Are you saying that the person just now looked a lot like you? Ariel waved a hand dismissively. Yeah. That's why I taught her a lesson. Her tone was smug as she continued. That bitch knew you liked me. She deliberately had plastic surgery to look like me. She tried to seduce you, to replace me. A chuckle escaped her lips, light and mocking. She even had the audacity to claim she was your wife. Isn't that ridiculous? But Brian's expression had shifted completely. His face was like a storm cloud, his gaze sharp and deadly. Without warning, he lunged forward, grabbing the collars of the two bodyguards who had buried my body. Where did you bury her? His voice was low, seething. The bodyguards paled, fear flashing across their faces. They pointed with trembling hands toward the outskirts of the courtyard. I in the wasteland, on the right side of the villa. The moment those words left their mouths, Brian took off running. Like a man possessed, he bolted toward the wasteland, his movements frantic and desperate. Brian? Brian, where are you going? Ariel's voice was shrill with confusion as she hurried after him, her best friends and bodyguards trailing behind. Brian, who had always been calm and composed, was completely unrecognizable. He ran at full speed, as if every second mattered. The moment he spotted the freshly dug grave, he dropped to his knees and began digging with his bare hands. His breathing was ragged. His eyes were bloodshot. He dug frantically. Following closely behind, Ariel finally caught up. When she saw what he was doing, her face twisted in outrage. Brian! What are you doing? Her voice was filled with disbelief and anger. Why are you digging up this bitch's grave? Do you only care about her? Her chest rose and fell, her hands clenched into fists. Didn't you say you love me? But Brian didn't even acknowledge her presence. He just kept digging, faster, deeper. Blood smeared across his hands as his fingernails tore against the rough earth. Even as his skin split open, he didn't stop. Ariel's patience snapped. She stormed forward, voice trembling with fury. "Brian! Wake up! I am your lover." Her voice wavered between desperation and rage. "Have you even thought about my feelings? Why are you so obsessed with this filthy bitch?" Her friends chimed in, their voices dripping with disgust. "Yes, Mr. Hawk. That woman was just a cheap counterfeit of Ariel. She used plastic surgery to look like her. How could you let her fool you? She even had the nerve to claim Ariel was the fake. That arrogant, despicable woman deserved to die." They spat insults, one after another. But Brian. He didn't hear a word. He just kept digging. And then, his hand struck something. With one final, desperate movement, he unearthed me. His breath caught in his throat. My body was covered in blood and dirt, lifeless in his arms. His face went blank. For the first time, his hands shook. Without hesitation, he wiped the blood and dirt off my face. Then, his voice, sharp and commanding, rang through the air. "Call an ambulance. Now." His bodyguards hesitated. One of them stepped forward cautiously. "Mr. Hawk. She's already dead." Silence. Then, without warning, Brian pulled out a dagger. In one swift, merciless motion, he drove it straight into the bodyguard's chest. Blood splattered onto the dirt. The guard's eyes widened in shock as he stumbled backward. Brian's expression was feral, unhinged. His voice, low and deadly, sent shivers down everyone's spine. "Who said she's dead?" His grip on my lifeless body tightened. "Without my permission." He bared his teeth, his next words dripping with madness. "She can't die." A certain private hospital's emergency room. The top medical experts from across the country had been gathered here. They stood in tense silence, brows furrowed with worry. Outside the emergency room, Brian stood motionless, his gaze fixed on the doors. He hadn't moved an inch since he arrived. Behind him, Ariel and her best friends lingered, watching cautiously. Finally, the surgical expert emerged from the emergency room. He let out a heavy sigh and shook his head. "Mr. Hawk, she's gone." Before he could finish, Brian grabbed him by the head and slammed him viciously against the wall. A sickening crack echoed through the corridor. Blood trickled down the doctor's forehead, but Brian's expression remained cold, unyielding. "I said I would protect her for a lifetime." His voice was eerily calm. "How could she possibly be dead?" His grip tightened, his knuckles turning white. "If she dies, none of you will live." The doctor, trembling, wiped the blood from his face and stumbled back into the emergency room to continue the resuscitation. Ariel's best friends exchanged nervous glances, whispering. "Ariel, why did Mr. Hawk dig up her grave and rush her here? He seems desperate to save her." "Yeah. What exactly is their relationship? Could he blame us for what happened to that woman?" Ariel, confident and unfazed, smirked. "Don't be ridiculous. Brian dotes on me to the core. He wouldn't turn against me." She folded her arms, speaking smugly. "That bitch was probably just some mistress Brian kept in the villa. Now that she's dead, he's naturally upset. But I'll comfort him later." Her best friend sighed in relief. "You're right. Look at Mr. Hawk, even though he's furious, he only takes his anger out on doctors and bodyguards. He hasn't said a single harsh word to you." "Exactly. This just proves how special you are to him, Ariel. That woman was nothing but a lowly stand-in. She can't compare to even a single strand of your hair." Hearing this, Ariel's confidence grew. She pouted slightly, putting on a pitiful expression before stepping closer to Brian. Her voice was soft, coaxing. "Brian, that woman kept trying to drive a wedge between us. She let out a small sigh. She claimed she was your wife and that I was just a substitute. I couldn't tolerate her lies, so I taught her a lesson. She leaned in closer. Who knew she'd be so weak? A few simple hits, and she died. Ariel's voice trembled slightly, as if she were the victim. I only did it because I was afraid of losing you. Brian, you won't blame me, will you? Brian slowly turned his head, his expression unreadable. His silence made Ariel uneasy. She gently took his hand, her voice turning soft and sweet. Brian, I know you love me. But just because someone looks like me doesn't mean they are me. She smiled seductively. You have me now. There's no need to keep a lowly counterfeit around. Ariel lifted a hand to touch his cheek. Since she's dead, I'll forgive you this time. From now on, let's just be together, okay? Don't make me sad again. She thought her words were gracious, magnanimous. She thought Brian would be deeply moved. Instead, Brian reached out, his fingers brushing gently against her face. His touch was light. His voice even softer. Ariel, there's something I forgot to tell you. His next words landed like a dagger to the chest. Estelle is my true love. My wife. Ariel staggered back, her face draining of color. Her best friends, who had been so sure of Ariel's position, visibly paled. They looked at each other in terror, before falling to their knees. Mr. Hawk, we didn't know she was your wife. If we had known, we never would have touched her. Yes, Mr. Hawk, everything was done on Ariel's orders. She told us to strip her, burn her hair, cut out her tongue. She ordered the bodyguards to torture her to death. It was all Ariel's idea. Just moments ago, these women had stood firmly by Ariel's side. Now, they had turned against her completely. Ariel's face twisted with rage. You hypocrites. You were all enjoying it while you were torturing her. And now you want to blame it all on me? She scoffed, her voice dripping with venom. You were born to be nothing but pathetic, backstabbing slaves. Her so-called friends didn't back down. And what about you? Who the hell are you? Yeah. You're just a stand-in. Mr. Hawk never truly loved you. You only caught his attention because you looked like Mrs. Hawk. But in the end, you're nothing but a cheap replacement. You tortured and killed the real hostess. Do you really think you deserve to live? Their words struck deep. Their voices rose, filled with malice, resentment, and desperation. But none of them noticed. Brian's eyes had turned blood red. That night, Brian remained outside the emergency room all night. He stood there, unmoving. And when the door finally opened, the doctors froze in horror. The hallway was soaked in blood. At Brian's feet, Ariel and her friends lay in a gruesome heap. Their bodies were twisted, broken. Their faces frozen in expressions of pure agony. None of them had died peacefully. The doctors, trembling, fell to their knees. Mr. Hawk, she's gone. One of them swallowed hard before continuing. We tried everything, but there was nothing more we could do. They didn't dare look at him directly. They feared that if they did, they would be the next lifeless bodies on the floor. But Brian didn't spare them a glance. He silently pushed past them and entered the emergency room. He approached the bed and reached out, his fingers trembling slightly as he touched my pale face. His movements were infinitely gentle, as if I were the most precious thing in the world. Slowly, carefully, he picked me up. He carried my lifeless body toward the window. The cold night air rushed in as he stood at the edge, looking down. The wind howled around him. Yet, his voice was soft, almost a whisper. Estelle. I promise to protect you. He held me closer, pressing his forehead against mine. No matter where you go. His lips curled into the faintest, most sorrowful smile. I will follow. And then, Brian stepped forward. From the 18th floor. He leapt into the darkness below.